Welcome to Dark Chronicle, where history's darkest shadows are brought quietly back to life. We travel east, far east of London and Rome and the courts of Renaissance Europe, to Constantinople, the city that sat at the crossroads of two worlds, where the minarets rose above the Golden Horn and the bazaars smelled of spice and leather and the particular dust of a city that had been accumulating history for 1,000 years. It is the early 16th century. The Ottoman Empire is at the height of its power, and in the innermost chambers of Topkapi Palace, something is happening that will change the course of an empire. A red-haired slave girl from the borderlands of Eastern Europe is about to become the most powerful woman in the world. Her name, the name history remembers her by, was Hürrem. They called her the Red Serpent. Let us begin. No one knows exactly where she was born. This is the first and most fundamental fact about Hürrem Sultan. That her origins are obscured by the same silence that obscured the origins of most enslaved people in the 16th century. The silence of a world that did not consider it worth recording where the powerless came from before they became useful to the powerful. What the sources agree on is this: she came from somewhere in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. Ruthenia, perhaps, roughly corresponding to modern-day Ukraine, or possibly Poland, or somewhere further east. She was young when she was taken, a girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, captured during one of the Ottoman raids that periodically swept through the frontier regions of the empire's European borders, gathering people along with livestock and grain and everything else that raids gathered. She was brought to Constantinople. She was assessed, as enslaved people were assessed, for her value, her health, her appearance, her apparent intelligence. She was given a name, Hürrem, meaning joyful, meaning laughing. A name that was either a recognition of something genuinely present in her character, or a piece of irony so cruel it defies comprehension, given the circumstances of her arrival. She was acquired for the imperial harem. The harem of Topkapi Palace in the early 16th century was not the fantasy that later European imagination constructed around the word. Not a perfume pleasure garden filled with passive women waiting for the Sultan's attention. It was something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than that. It was a political institution, a world unto itself, governed by its own hierarchies and its own rules, populated by women of extraordinary diversity, who had arrived there from every corner of the empire and beyond, and who navigated their circumstances with the full range of human intelligence and ambition and desperation that circumstances of that kind tend to produce. The hierarchy was clear. At its apex was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose power within the harem was absolute, and whose influence on the Sultan himself was, in many cases, the most significant political force in the empire. Below her were the Hasekis, the Sultan's favoured concubines, who had attracted his particular attention and had borne him children. Below them were the other concubines, ranked by seniority and favour, and at the very bottom were the new arrivals, the girls who had just come in, who knew nothing and no one, who had to learn very quickly the intricate geography of this closed world if they wanted to survive in it. Hürrem arrived at the bottom. She did not stay there long. What exactly happened in those first months is not recorded with precision. The harem was by its nature a closed world. What happened within it stayed within it. The sources that do exist are colored by the agendas of those who wrote them. Most were male, most were outsiders, and most brought to their descriptions all the projections and fantasies that outsiders have always brought to spaces they cannot enter and do not understand. But the result is clear. She attracted the attention of Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman was, at the time of Hürrem's arrival, in his mid-20s and newly ascended to the Sultanate, a man who had inherited the most powerful empire in the world at an age when most men are still finding their footing. He was already demonstrating the qualities that would earn him the title by which history would know him. Intelligent, disciplined, deeply serious about the exercise of power, interested in poetry and architecture and law as well as warfare. A man of focused, sustained attention, who engaged with the things and people he found genuinely interesting, with a completeness that set him apart from lesser rulers. He found Hürrem genuinely interesting. The qualities that attracted his attention can only be inferred from what followed, from the poetry he wrote to her, from the letters that passed between them over decades, from the accounts of those who observed them together. She was, by all accounts, quick-minded, possessed of an intelligence that expressed itself in conversation, in the rapid reading of situations, in the ability to understand immediately what was at stake and what was needed. She was apparently funny, genuinely funny, not the performed lightness of a woman trying to please, but a real wit, a quickness that surprised people and disarmed them before they realized what was happening. And she was, from the very beginning, strategically aware in a way that went far beyond mere cleverness. She understood the world she had entered with a clarity that suggested she had been thinking about how to navigate it from the moment she arrived. She saw the hierarchies, she saw the alliances and the enmities, she saw which doors were open and which were locked, and, more importantly, she saw which locked doors might be opened by the right key. She had arrived with nothing, not a name, not a past, not a family, not a language she could use with anyone around her. Every advantage she would acquire in this place, she would have to build herself. Out of whatever she found within her, she began to build. But there was an obstacle. Her name was Mahidevran. Mahidevran Sultan was Suleiman's established favorite, the Haseki, who had held his particular attention for years before Hürrem's arrival. She had borne him a son, Shehzade Mustafa, and that son was widely regarded as the heir apparent to the greatest empire in the world. Mahidevran was not a woman to be easily displaced. She was proud, she was established. She had the backing of the military establishment and the old guard of the palace, and she had a son who was, by every conventional measure, the logical successor to the Sultanate. The confrontation between the two women was, by the accounts that survive, direct and physical. There is a story, appearing in Venetian diplomatic dispatches from the period, and therefore at least somewhat removed from the immediate politics of the Ottoman court, that Mahidevran confronted Hürrem physically on one occasion, striking her and tearing her hair and scratching her face, and that when Suleiman subsequently sent for Hürrem, she refused to come to him in her damaged state. She told him what had happened. Mahidevran, when questioned, confirmed it, and reportedly added that Hürrem had gotten only what she deserved, being a mere servant, while she, Mahidevran, was the Sultan's true favorite. It was a miscalculation of extraordinary proportions. Suleiman's response to this confrontation, his clear and demonstrated preference for Hürrem in its aftermath, signaled something that those paying close attention in the palace would have understood immediately. The balance of power was shifting. A new force had arrived in Topkapi, and it was not going to be dislodged by pride or seniority or the weight of established precedent. Hürrem understood this too. She did not press her advantage immediately. She did not need to. She was patient, had been patient from the moment she arrived, building slowly, steadily, without the kind of visible ambition that attracts opposition before it is ready to meet it. She was learning. She was always learning. She learned Ottoman Turkish with a speed that impressed those who taught her. She learned the customs of the court, the forms of address, the protocols that governed every interaction in this world, where a misstep could end everything. She learned to write, and she wrote letters to Suleiman that were, by the evidence of his responses, remarkable documents. Not the letters of a concubine angling for favor, but the letters of a person engaging with another person as an equal, discussing poetry, politics, the events of the day, the nature of power, the meaning of loyalty. Suleiman kept every letter. He wrote back at length, in verse as well as prose, with the full attention of a man who had found, in the most unexpected of places, someone he could actually talk to. This was, in the end, the foundation of everything that followed. Not beauty alone, though she had that. Not ambition alone, though she had that in abundance. But the rarer and more durable quality of genuine intellectual companionship, the ability to meet a formidable mind on its own ground and hold the conversation there, year after year, decade after decade, without either party growing bored or diminished. She had arrived in Constantinople as a slave girl with nothing. She was becoming, in the mind of the most powerful man in the world, indispensable. And she had barely begun. The shift in the palace was not sudden. It never is, in places where power moves slowly, and the consequences of moving too fast are severe. But those who watched carefully, the ambassadors, the viziers, the women of the harem, who had spent years learning to read the invisible currents of the court, could see it happening. Suleiman was changing. Not in his public role. He remained outwardly the same figure of absolute authority that the empire required him to be. He conducted his campaigns, received his ambassadors, administered justice, presided over the extraordinary cultural flowering that would make his reign one of the most remarkable in Ottoman history. But in the private spaces of Topkapi, in the hours between the public duties of empire, he was spending his time differently. He was spending it with Hürrem. They talked. They wrote to each other. Letters that crossed the palace in the hands of trusted servants. Letters that have survived in the archives and that reveal, unmistakably, the quality of what was between them. Suleiman wrote poetry to her. Real poetry, not the ceremonial verse that sultans were expected to produce, but something more personal and more urgent, the poetry of a man who had found something he had not expected to find and was trying to put it into language. She wrote back. Her letters are harder to characterize than his poems. They are the letters of a woman who is always aware of her situation, who writes with the knowledge that every word may be read by eyes other than the intended ones, who has learned to say what she means through what she does not say as much as through what she does, but the feeling in them is unmistakable. She was not performing attachment. She was genuinely attached to this man, to this strange and brutal world she had been thrown into, to the life she was building inside it with the only materials available to her. She bore him children. First a daughter, Mihrima, who would grow up to be a significant figure in her own right, a woman of considerable political intelligence who would, in time, surpass even her mother in the scope of her influence. Then sons, Mehmed, then Abdullah, then Selim, then Bayezid, then Cihangir. 6 children in total, which was itself remarkable. No woman in the recorded history of the Ottoman imperial harem had maintained the Sultan's favour so continuously and so exclusively. This exclusivity was, in itself, a revolution. The Ottoman system had been built on the principle of dynastic multiplication. The Sultan was expected to distribute his attention among multiple concubines, producing multiple sons, ensuring that the empire would have heirs in sufficient number to survive the inevitable losses of time and circumstance. The concentration of a sultan's favour on a single woman was not merely unusual. It was, in the eyes of the old guard, a distortion of the natural order of things, a dangerous narrowing of the imperial succession, a sign that something had gone deeply wrong in Topkapi. What had gone wrong, from their perspective, was Hürrem. She was blamed for everything, for Suleiman's increasing reliance on diplomacy over warfare in certain areas. She was accused of making him soft, for the growing influence of the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who was Suleiman's closest male friend, and who was suspected of being in some kind of alliance with Hürrem, though this alliance, if it existed, would prove short-lived and fatal for Ibrahim, for the declining influence of Mahidevran and the relegation of Shehzadeh Mustafa to an increasingly peripheral position. The European ambassadors wrote about her with a mixture of fascination and alarm. She was described as a witch, as a sorceress, as a woman who had used supernatural means to bind the Sultan to her. These descriptions tell us more about the men writing them than about Hürrem. Faced with a woman exercising power in ways they could not account for through the frameworks available to them, they reached for the language of the supernatural, because it was the only explanation their world offered for female power that exceeded its prescribed limits. She was not a witch. She was something considerably more dangerous than a witch. She was a woman of exceptional intelligence operating in a system that had not been designed to contain her, and she had understood from very early on that the only way to survive in that system, let alone to thrive in it, was to change it. And she did. The first and most dramatic change came in 1534. Suleiman freed her. The exact circumstances of this decision are not entirely clear in the historical record. What is clear is that Hürrem was no longer a slave. She was a free woman. And then, in a move that shocked the Ottoman court and the diplomatic world beyond it, Suleiman married her. Legally, formally, with a ceremony. This had not happened before. Not in the living memory of anyone at court. Not in the records that the court kept of its own history. Sultans did not marry their concubines. The harem system existed precisely to prevent this. to ensure that the women who bore the Sultan's children remained in a position of dependence that guaranteed their subordination and the Sultan's freedom. Marriage changed everything. Marriage made Hürrem not merely the mother of princes, but the Sultan's wife, the Haseki Sultan, a title that had to be created for her because no title existed for what she had become. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier and Suleiman's closest friend, made his opposition known. He had been the most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan, and he had used that power with the confidence of someone who believed his position was unassailable. He had misjudged the situation. Hürrem had been watching him for years, had been accumulating her own understanding of his weaknesses and the enmities he had generated through the exercise of his enormous power, and she understood something that Ibrahim had failed to appreciate, that the Sultan's friendship, however deep and genuine, was not the same as the Sultan's judgment, and that a man who trusted too completely in personal loyalty was vulnerable to the moment when that loyalty was tested by sufficient evidence of betrayal. In 1536, Ibrahim Pasha was executed. The evidence against him was real. He had overstepped in ways that genuinely threatened the empire's stability, had made promises and representations to foreign powers that went far beyond his authority, had conducted himself with an arrogance that had generated enemies throughout the court. The case against him was not manufactured, but Hürrem had ensured that the case was heard, had ensured that the right information reached the right ears at the right moment, had positioned herself, over years of careful work, as someone whose judgment the Sultan trusted, not merely as a wife and companion, but as a political advisor whose read of people and situations had proven reliable again and again. Ibrahim was gone. The new Grand Vizier was Rustem Pasha. Rustem Pasha was Hürrem's son-in-law. He had married Mihrima, Hürrem's daughter, in an arrangement that was almost certainly engineered by Hürrem herself. The most powerful official position in the Ottoman Empire, below the Sultan, was now held by a man who was family, a man whose political interests were aligned with hers, a man who understood that his position depended in significant measure on her continued influence. She had restructured the Grand Vizierate around her own network, and she was not finished. The darkest chapter of Hürrem's story, the one that has defined her reputation in history, that has made her name synonymous with political ruthlessness, concerns Shehzade Mustafa. Mustafa was Mahidevran's son. He was older than Hürrem's sons. He was experienced. He was by all accounts genuinely capable. A prince who had spent years governing a provincial territory and who had developed in that time a following among the military that was real and significant. The Janissaries loved him. The old guard of the court saw in him the natural heir to the Sultanate, the continuation of the proper order of things. He was also, from Hürrem's perspective, an existential threat. In the Ottoman system, the death of a sultan was followed almost inevitably by the execution of the new sultan's brothers. The ruthless logic of a system in which multiple heirs meant multiple potential claimants, and multiple potential claimants meant civil war. If Mustafa became sultan, Hürrem's sons would die. All of them. It was not a possibility. It was a certainty. She moved to prevent it. The exact mechanism of what happened is debated by historians and was debated by contemporaries. What the sources agree on is this. evidence reached Suleiman through channels that led directly or indirectly back to Hürrem and Rüstem Pasha, that Mustafa was plotting against him, that the prince had been in communication with the empire's enemies, that he intended to seize power before his father's death, rather than wait for it. Whether this evidence was true, fabricated, or something in between, is a question that the historical record does not resolve with certainty. What is certain is that Suleiman believed it. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his military camp and had him strangled. The grief in the empire was immediate and widespread. Mustafa had been genuinely popular, and his death was felt as a loss far beyond the political. Mahidevran, who had spent years in enforced poverty and isolation while Hürrem rose, refused to leave her son's body. She stayed with it for days, refusing the burial that would have been organized by the court, until Suleiman himself ordered that Mustafa be buried with the honors appropriate to his rank. Hürrem had won. Her sons were safe. The succession was secured. The empire would pass to one of her children, as she had worked for years to ensure. She lived only a few more years after Mustafa's death. She died in 1558 in Topkapi Palace, in the rooms she had occupied for decades, the rooms of the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, a position she had built from nothing, from the absolute zero of a slave girl with no name and no past and no future except the one she made for herself. Suleiman outlived her by 8 years. He never remarried. He wore black for a year after her death. An extraordinary public display of grief from a man for whom public displays of any personal feeling were extremely unusual. He had loved her, whatever else she had been, and she had been many things, some of them terrible. He had loved her genuinely and completely, and she had loved him, in whatever way a woman in her position could love the man who held absolute power over her life and the lives of her children. The Red Serpent was gone, but the empire she had shaped, the court she had restructured, the alliances she had built, the sons she had protected, continued. Her daughter, Mirima, would go on to be one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. Her son Selim would succeed to the Sultanate. The line would continue. She had arrived with nothing. She left her mark on an empire that would last for centuries. Good night. This has been Dark Chronicle. We will be here again with another story from history's shadow. Until then, rest well.